Welcome to the ELA Learning Alliance for topic number 5. My name is Pascal Mio. I'll be your moderator for this topic, which is focused on analyzing enforceability. And the key question we are trying to answer is how do horizontal accountability mechanisms work within the legislative branch of government. The topic therefore challenges us to focus on the capability of parliaments in Africa and congresses in Latin America to ensure executive accountability through questions and answers using the case of Kenya and congressional requests for information in the case of Argentina. The discussion for this topic is informed by the research that was conducted in Argentina by CHIPEC and in Kenya by Austria. The Austria team in Kenya focused on the questions and answer mechanism, and their findings were that the question and answer mechanisms were very, very frequently used and popular in the Kenya National Assembly and the Senate. The team covered questions and answers spanning over the period 2006 to 2010, with a main focus on the content of the questions, their probative value, the articulation and the argumentation capacities or capabilities of the members of parliament, and the nature of responses given by the executive to the questions. The questions were rather weak on capacity to probe and to lead to concrete answers. Therefore, the team concluded that the probative value of the questions was low. Their interrogative level also was found to be on the average, and the team found that generally the questions were presented in an emotionally charged fashion, and this tended to elicit emotionally charged responses, thereby reducing the value of the outcomes expected from the questions. There was also an element of partisanship in both the questions and the answers, as the members of parliament, when raising questions, were tended to be more influenced by their party affinities and affiliations, and the responses from government tended to be very defensive. Some questions also made allegations, for example, on the lack of transparency or corruption, but in some cases, such questions were not backed by evidence which could be used to elicit concrete answers. And generally, the questions and the answers did not indicate a high level of prior research. In other words, they were not very much evidence-based. In addition to these problems, the team noted that the responses by the executive also reflected some problems. For example, on several occasions, ministers either failed to turn up, or when they turn up, they gave unsatisfactory answers. There were also instances, more than one time, where it was not clear in parliament which of the ministries was supposed to answer which questions. In other instances, especially on issues of governance and security, the Official Secrets Act was invoked and used by ministers or government officials to refuse to answer questions. It was clear that between 2006 and 2010, before the new constitution, that there was no clear mechanism for parliament to make a follow-up on the questions raised, answers given, or action promised to be taken. In addition, the Austria team assessed the capacity of members of parliament to use the question and answer mechanism using the following indicators. The first one was articulation capacity. The second is research capacity. Third, presentation capacity. Third, packaging. Fourth, negotiation. Fifth, argumentation. And also debating and follow-up capacity. Articulation capacity was measured in terms of how to frame and pose questions, and this was found to be weak. There was also the problem of leading questions, which were actually enabling the members of the executive to give answers that either exaggerated or distorted the actual performance. Then there was a problem of vague questions, questions which were vague enough to allow ambiguous answers. And in addition, some questions were not backed by research or any evidence, and this enabled ministers to dismiss them. Capacity for argumentation was also weak because there was more confrontation in some of the questions or the majority of the questions than argumentation. In the whole process, the question and answer sessions reflected low capacity for negotiation. There was also a problem of misplaced questions. Some questions which were brought to Parliament and tabled on the floor were on issues or matters which need not to be raised in Parliament. They could be raised at county or even at lower levels. For example, issues related to dismissal of an employee from employment in a small private enterprise do not have to be brought, for example, in front or before Parliament. But on the whole, in spite of these limitations, the questions raised were very pertinent and important in the livelihoods of the people in Kenya. The majority of the questions were on agriculture, transport, governance, land and housing, education, defense, security, and labor issues. But conspicuously low in frequency were questions on transparency and corruption. Apart from questions and answers, the Austria team also focused on private member motions, and it found that private member motions were very frequently used in the Parliament of Kenya. They were hotly debated by MPs from both sides of the House. They were less partisan and managed to be addressed in non-partisan way and touched issues mainly which either were forgotten or not addressed by the executive. The responses of the executive to these member motions were more positive than to the questions raised by members of Parliament. And it was thought that this was because most of the member motions, private member motions, were raised on bipartisan basis. In spite of the positive aspects of the private member motions, the discussions and the debates on these motions were also affected by the same capacity constraints which affected or tended to affect questions and answer mechanisms. In assessing the mechanism on the part of Kenya generally, the team noted that in spite of efforts made by members to increase their inputs on enforcement mechanisms, there are institutional, procedural, and other cultural factors which tend to constrain and impose binding constraints on their capabilities to do so. In the cluster of institutional limitations, it was noted, for example, that the government capacity and power to control the budget up to 85% was giving it so much clout that it made members of Parliament very dependent on it because they all have constituencies on which depend on allocations of resources by the government. So they tend actually to be a little bit diplomatic and friendly in the way they tackle and raise questions and motions in Parliament. There was also the issue of interlocking memberships. Although the Constitution of Kenya contains provisions preventing officials in top government and other institutions from holding official positions in lower bodies, such as in parastatal boards, there is still a phenomenon of interlocking memberships on such boards, and representation of members of parliament and members of government on such institutions really dilutes their role in enforcing mechanisms for horizontal accountability. Then, of course, there is the patronage problem, which is related to the role of the state or the executive basically as the overall provider of resources and its total control of decisions, whether it is at local or national level, decisions on distribution of resources. This gives it a lot of power, and it affects the capability of the legislators to enforce these accountability mechanisms. The second set of limitations are procedural limitations. These include the party discipline and the party whip system, which in actual practice restricts the freedom of expression for MPs where they want to differ with their party, when they don't want to toe the official line. Then there is the problem of standing orders, which in Kenya, like in many other African countries, are very lengthy, very complicated, and they need time to get used to, and they become a constraint, especially to new members who are not used to these rules. And third, there is the issue of parallel accountability, which basically is reflected in the existence of multiple platforms of accountability. For example, the county assemblies, national assembly, and the Senate. For many representatives, it is still confusing which issue at which platform such issues should be aired. Then there is the set of barriers which we have called cultural barriers. In this one, the first one is the issue of power brokerage. The Kenya political system operates through power brokers. These are normally called kingpins or queenpins. These are people who control what representatives can do and say in representative bodies. They are mainly informal systems which condition which questions, which motions, the nature of the debates, and the level of delivery of MPs. In addition to this, there is the issue of social networks, and the politics in Kenya and in many African and perhaps even Latin American countries is operated through networking. All the school networks systems, all the business networks, religious networks, and even predatory networks, mainly cutting across the legislature and the executive, and even cutting across political parties, tend to influence the way questions, motions, debates are organized, and the contributions of MPs in Parliament, and the outcomes of horizontal accountability. Lastly, on this is the issue of restricted loyalty. In the African society, members of society do operate within the basis of their ethnic, social, and other affinities, and they attach a lot of loyalty either to their community or to their household or to their ethnic group. And this element of culture tends to spill into behavior of representatives in legislative organs. Members of parliament tend to defend anybody coming from either their political group or social group or ethnic group, even if and when they know such a person is wrong. And also members of the executive tend to receive comments, questions, criticism negatively or positively, depending on the ethnic or social affiliation or affinity of the person raising questions. This, of course, tends to affect the nature and profile of discussions and debates, and it negatively affects the outcome of, or in Parliament, outcomes of horizontal accountability. The CHIPEC team conducted its research on accountability mechanisms in Argentina, and it focused on the request for information from the executive by both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate in Argentina. But it started with a general overview, which is bigger than what we shall present. In the general overview, the report of CHIPEC covers practices in Mexico, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. On Mexico, they found that the Chamber of Deputies was responsible for revising the budget with a constitutionally fixed time limit. They also found that the Supreme Audit Office is constitutionally vested with the power to monitor, evaluate, audit public expenditure, and take action, and its reports are submitted to the Chamber of Deputies. Similar practices are constitutionally entrenched in the Brazil and the Chilean systems. The general overview, the CHIPEC team focused specifically on Argentina, and it starts with a general presentation on the National Audit Office, and it has found that the National Audit Office is empowered to provide technical assistance to the Congress by auditing financial operations of ministries, secretariats, and other government bodies. Then the National Audit Office is constitutionally an independent body with a president who is proposed by the largest opposition group in Congress. The NAO, that is the National Audit Office, conducts audits, but it cannot impose sanctions or file cases in courts of law. If it discovers anomalies, irregularities, or violations, it can just report them to Congress. In Congress, however, there is a special committee composed of senators and deputies known as the Mixed Committee of Public Accounts. This is an equivalent of the Public Accounts Committee in Kenya, and this mixed committee in Argentina has the prerogative on how to act on the NAO reports, that is, the reports which come from the National Audit Office. These powers include filing a report, asking for further information, ordering the assessment of responsibility and financial damage, informing the anti-corruption agency, or even filing a case in the Criminal Court of Appeals. Now, those who are familiar with the system in Kenya or in Africa in general, it will be noted that this is an advanced system because the PAC, that is the Public Account Committees in African countries, have no power even to inform or to communicate with the anti-corruption bodies, let alone power to file a case directly without going through the Attorney General to the criminal investigation or criminal courts. So this is something which is a lesson that can be taken from Latin America. Then the mechanism which is frequently used in Argentina is for Congress to request the executive to provide information under Article 71 of the National Constitution and also under the rules of procedure that govern the two chambers Generally, however, the CHIPEC team noted that there is a lot of limitations on the effectiveness of the information request mechanism. For example, that there is no time limit within which the executive has to provide the requested information. Secondly, they also noted that there are no provisions for sanctions if the information requested is not provided in time or even not provided at all. Furthermore, they noted that the rules of procedure also provide for room for shortcuts which can be used to allow reports to be approved without being debated or for the requested information to have been provided. However, they noted that there are remedies which are available to Congress in case of problems, and these include the right of impeachment, that Congress can move a motion to impeach the president and vote on it, or its members can table motions for accusation of the president, vice president, chief of cabinet, ministers, or even members of the Supreme Court. And before the Senate, they can table requests for accusation before Senate, and Senate can judge the accused. The possibility of impeachment provides incentives on the part of the executive to enhance their performance. Although the CHIPEC team notes that in the case of Argentina, no such action has ever been taken. Another limitation noted by the CHIPEC team is that the specific procedures regarding the way in which information is exchanged between the chief of the cabinet and the legislators is laid down in the rules of procedure of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate. But they note that some of these procedures related to sessions are not specifically specified, meaning they are not clear. This, they say, could easily lead to confrontation between different political blocs in these two houses. They also note the frequency and rates of approval of deputies arising from their performance in airing or requesting for answers. They note that between 1999 and 2013, there were on the average 1,345 requests for information, and that 35% of these were approved. But also they note that only about 21.8% of them got answers. They noted that the period or the duration or the lapse of time between the time questions are put on the table and answers are obtained is lengthy. It takes even more, or up to a year. And they note that this could reduce the effectiveness of the mechanism. In terms of frequency, the data provided by CHIPEC team shows that the number of requests for information has been going down since 1997. And also they say that the number of responses by the executive has also been going down since 2005. But they note that this is having an impact on the approval rating of the deputies. And the decreasing number of the requests for information by incumbent representatives in the two houses has negatively impacted on their approval rate since 2003. In assessing the effectiveness of the mechanism, that is the request for information mechanism, CHIPEC interviewed some representatives or legislators and asked them what they thought were the causes or factors behind the low effectiveness of this mechanism. The responses indicated that, number one, legislators felt that the questions were too general, that most of them actually related only to bills or proposed bills. Secondly, that some questions were aimed at individuals' self-projection, that some members were asking so that they could be seen to be active in the legislation, in the legislative bodies. The third response was that there was lack of timelines on answers to be given and acts to be taken, and that this was acting as a disincentive for many people to ask questions. Fourth, they noted that the procedures were not properly coordinated and not properly organized. And fifth, they noted that sometimes the speed of approval of the questions depended on the party affiliation of those requesting for information, and that chances were that opposition legislators were less likely to get their requests approved than incumbent legislators. Following the research results and the findings of the two teams, and we think you will do the further reading yourselves, we have come to the conclusion that African and Latin American countries are experiencing similar and different challenges on enforceability of mechanisms. The similar challenges tend to include powerful executive bodies that tend to resist full accountability, the dominance of ruling parties in legislative bodies that impacts on collective action by members of parliament, political parties that are still going through processes of transformation and necessarily and essentially driven by competition rather than competitive cooperation, limitations of space for rapid responses by the executive, and unclear demarcation of powers. In the discussion, we encourage you to look for factors that may be introduced to strengthen the capacity for enforceability. For example, we encourage you to read the speech of the president of the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, which was delivered when he was opening the 10th Parliament in June 2016, in which he made proposals which can be used to strengthen the capacity of parliaments to enforce mechanisms that increase horizontal accountability. He suggested, for example, that better outcomes can be achieved if proposals are sent to parliaments in time and the response of parliaments acted upon in time, that improvements could be achieved if the principle of public good and public interest could take precedence over personal and private interests, that we could achieve better results if all representatives in all political parties went to parliament and immediately and continuously practiced what they proclaimed during election campaigns, and that there would be a lot of improvement if legislators and executive officials lead by example. We also suggest that there could be improvement if legislators and executive officials take a holistic approach to issues and tackle them together in a non-partisan manner. And also he suggests that time and timing of questions and responses could be made more adequate. Debating and presentation skills could, if strengthened, improve the quality of inputs and outcomes. Freedom of expression, if promoted in the legislative bodies, could also increase the value of input. And he also suggests that parliaments and executive bodies should try to look for ways of accommodating minorities and minority groups and recognize them and listen to them and ensure that their inputs are accommodated. And he ends up by finally suggesting that if things could greatly improve if the conduct of members is commensurate with their roles, their mission, and their clear conscience. I hope the background we have provided will give you information which you can use in the discussion. I thank you for your attention. Gracias. Asante sana.